This is a tepui. Tucked away in the heart of South America lies a hidden gem that might just rival the Galapagos' evolutionary history. Also known as tabletop mountains, tepuis are colossal and imposing geological formations found in South America, more specifically in the Guianan Shield. Rising abruptly from the surrounding lowlands, tepuis are cut off to the rest of the world by steep cliffs. The unique climate creates flat, often grassy summits that create an otherworldly landscape. Tepuis are almost unparalleled for their isolation, with their summits resembling islands in terms of evolution, separated from one another in the surrounding lowlands. The isolated nature of the tepuis has led to the evolution of numerous endemic species found nowhere else on Earth. Despite the harsh and inhospitable conditions found atop tepuis, life has adapted and thrived in this seemingly desolate environment due to the unique adaptations made by plants and animals. If you want to understand how life adapted to live on Tepui, then keep watching as I explain how reptiles and amphibians adapted to survive in this extreme environment. To understand why these mountains have given rise to such a unique collection of animals, we must first understand how they formed. Tepuis are the remains of a large sandstone plateau that once covered the supercontinent of Gondwana, where layers of sand were compressed to form harder rock thousands of meters thick. Following the tectonic uplift 180 million years ago, the sandstone plateau was broken apart into fragments to form isolated mountaintops which have since been further isolated by erosion. This ancient isolation has given rise to spectacular rates of endemism. About 60% of the angiosperms, commonly referred to as flowering plants, found on the tepuis, only live on a single tepui, meaning that the tepuis aren't just separated from the lowlands, but each other. Possibly the most famous species to exist on tepuis are toads from the Oreophrynella genus, more commonly referred to as bush toads. All less than 26 millimeters in size, they are a small group of toads. Some of their unique adaptations include breeding through direct development, which means that they do not undergo metamorphosis in water like most amphibians. This adaptation likely arose to enable them to survive in areas where there is a lack of suitable aquatic breeding habitat, such as the unstable climate during the Pleistocene. But as climatic conditions stable during the Holocene, this adaptation is no longer as important. However, all bush toads keep this adaptation to this day. They also have unique mechanisms to escape predators, including the pebble toad rolling away and the waterfall toad jumping from meters above the ground. They have opposable fingers, which is unique among toads, and allows them to traverse the rocky summits of tepuis. Meanwhile, the bush toads found in forests use these to climb trees, which is an example of exaptation, where a trait serves a different function from what it evolved for. As of recording this video, 8 bush toads have been described, 6 that live on tepui summits, and 2 that live in forested lowlands, including the waterfall toad living at the base of tepuis, which I mentioned previously, and the Weyasipu toad, which only inhabits one chasm found on the Weyasipu tepui, a very impressive example of a microendemic amphibian, perhaps only beaten by the Kihansi spray toad of Tanzania, only living in the spray zone of one waterfall. To see how the tepuis force animals to evolve, let's compare the bush toads on rocky plateaus against those found in the forested lowlands. The most obvious differences are their colours. Those found on summits are darker, which enables them to blend in with their surroundings. For example, you can see that the pebble toad and Roraima bush toad are completely black, as the tepuis they inhabit have a very small amount of vegetation. But when looking at the Wey tepui toad, which inhabits a summit, this may not be so true. But if you compare the vegetation of Wey tepui with Mount Roraima, it makes sense. Instead of wandering the large open rock surfaces, it spends most of its time in thick peat bog vegetation, meaning that it never evolved the camouflage needed to blend in with the dark rocks. Looking at Sea Gobbin's toad, we can see that it has some orange coloration, possibly because Mount Moringa has plentiful vegetation cover, indicating that it is likely on the path to losing its coloration, but hasn't been living there long enough to have completely gone orange. As evolution occurs so quickly here, I'd give it another 1,000 years until it becomes completely orange. You might wonder why it's beneficial to have a brighter colour. It is most likely a good way of indicating which individuals are most fertile, as the healthiest animals are the brightest. This adaptive coloration is a good example of convergent evolution, which is when two species develop the same characteristic independent of each other, due to inhabiting a similar environment, as the bush toads that inhabit similar conditions evolve to become a similar colour, independently of each other. Other amphibians found on the tepuis include the Stephania genus, also known as carrying frogs, as they grow from eggs to froglets entirely on the back of females. Other members of the Hemiphractidae family also breed like this, which makes me wonder if this behaviour evolved on tepuis due to the harsh conditions, or if they were able to colonise tepuis because they had already evolved this. I tried to look into this, but I couldn't find any information. But the fact that carrying frogs are far isolated from other Hemiphractidae genuses leads me to believe that this trait did not evolve in the Tepui region. The demonic poison frog is the only member of its genus, and is entirely confined to Xeroiapacana. It was once common, often being seen in bromeliads up until the 1980s, when thousands of illegal miners came to the region, with satellite images in 2019 revealing that a mine had been made on the Tepui itself. The species is also currently being over-collected for the pet trade, with hundreds having been taken from the wild, leading to it being listed as critically endangered. Pseudomantis is the only genus of frogs in its family. They are all found on tepuis. Their toes are completely separated and lack webbing, and even the males lack nuptial pads. They are not found on the flat, rocky, open land on a tepui, and instead they live in the forest canopy near streams. Hardly anything is known about this family, and it is not known why it lacks webbing, but they likely breathe through direct development, so would not need webbed feet to push through the water. It is very likely that there are many more species of this genus to be discovered, but they are very hard to find as they live in the canopy of trees as much as 15 meters above the ground. Now that I have covered some of the amphibians of the tepuis, I think it's time we have a look at the reptiles. Pantepuisaurus was only discovered in 2009 and is thought to be the only member of its genus, and so far has only been found on Mount Maringma. As it has been described only from a single specimen collected in a very remote area, it's unknown whether it's common or rare, and even its habitat type is not known, although it likely lives in shrubland. Geckos are perhaps the most common reptile group in the neotropics, so it is unsurprising that they have colonized the tepuis as well. But only 2 species have done so, both from the Gonatodes genus. What possibly gave this genus an advantage that enabled them to survive in the tepuis is that they have longer, more claw-like fingers than typical geckos. As the tepuis are flat, they would not have needed to climb vertically, and long fingers would have allowed them to traverse rocky tepui summits more easily, to both escape predators and hunt down prey. The only lava lizard endemic to the tepuis is the keeled lava lizard, which is frequently seen scurrying between rocky areas. However, they are heavily dependent on the sun, so cannot be found on more shaded tepuis, and are most likely fairly recent arrivals to tepuis, as it would have been just too cold during the Pleistocene interglacial period. A few species of snake have also made the tepuis their home, including 5 Dryophylax species. Despite not being the most abundant genus of snakes in the region, they have been able to dominate the Pantepui realm, possibly because of their diet consisting mainly of amphibians, which we already know are abundant on tepuis. But perhaps the main reason that they are so successful on tepuis is because they are viviparous, meaning that they give birth to live young. This is advantageous for 2 reasons. The first is that there is a lack of soil on tepuis, so there wouldn't be suitable habitat for egg laying. And the second is that during glacial times, eggs would not have survived as it would have just been too cold. But because they give birth to live young, they are able to heat them up just by basking in the sun. Although tepuis are some of the most untouched pieces of wilderness in the world, that doesn't keep them safe from climate change. As tepuis are flat, they have a very similar climate across the tepui, meaning that native animals have adapted to a very specific temperature range. And as the tepuis are flat, animals will not be able to migrate to higher altitude areas in the future. But the biggest threat is not the change in temperature, but the change in rainfall. That will have drastic impacts on the wildlife of tepuis, particularly the amphibians. It is predicted that the rainfall will decrease by 10% over the coming decades. This will be devastating to amphibians as they rely on consistent humidity levels for their survival, as they need to keep moist to be able to breed and breathe. This is particularly sad on tepuis, as there are so many species living there that have yet to be found. So who knows what will be found in the future.